Look at this building right here. Now tell me, who built it and exactly when?
You'll probably say some European architect from the 1800s, but what if I told you that answer is completely, provably wrong? What if the official story of how these buildings came to exist is a lie? Not a theory, not a conspiracy, a demonstrable architectural lie. Today, we are going to look at real buildings and real photographs. We will examine real historical maps that anyone can verify for themselves. We are going to ask questions that mainstream historians refuse to answer publicly. By the end of this video, you will never look at old buildings the same way again. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you will genuinely shake your worldview. This is not entertainment. This is a serious examination of architectural evidence, and the evidence points to a conclusion that changes everything we think we know. Let's start with the basics, the story we were all taught in school. According to mainstream history, most grand buildings were built in the 1800s. We're talking about huge cathedrals, massive government halls, ornate train stations. The story says armies of workers with basic hand tools built all of this in decades. No electricity, no cranes, no modern machinery, just muscle in primitive mortar. And somehow, these workers produced structures that modern engineers struggle to replicate. Does that make sense to you? Because it never made sense to me. Let's take one example that destroys the official timeline almost immediately. Let's talk about the buildings shown at the World's Fairs of the 1800s. In 1851, London hosted the Great Exhibition inside the Crystal Palace structure. Crystal Palace was a massive iron and glass building covering over 90,000 square meters. According to official records, it was designed in just 10 days, and then it was fully constructed in under 9 months. 9 months for one of the largest buildings in human history at that time. Meanwhile, today, it takes 2 to 3 years to build a modern shopping mall. So either Victorian workers were superhuman or something else is going on here. Now, let's jump to America, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the White City. Over 200 buildings were constructed for that single event in under 2 years. The architectural detail on these buildings was extraordinary by any standard. Columns, sculptures, domes, intricate carved facades stretching hundreds of meters. And then, after the fair, almost every single one of them was demolished or burned. Why would anyone spend millions building something that magnificent only to destroy it? That question, my friends, is exactly where this rabbit hole begins. Hold that thought. We are coming back to the burning question in part 4. But first, I need to show you something about the buildings themselves that nobody talks about. Now I want to focus on something very specific, the windows. Look at any photograph of a large 19th century building and count the windows carefully. You will find hundreds of them, perfectly symmetrical, perfectly proportioned. Each window is framed with intricate stone carvings that take master craftsmen weeks to complete.
But here is the part that breaks the official story completely open. Many of these buildings have what researchers now call zero windows. Zero windows are windows that have absolutely no functional purpose. They are bricked up from the inside. They face into solid walls. Some of them open onto floors that don't exist. They exist only on the exterior surface, purely for visual symmetry. Now ask yourself, why would a budget-conscious 19th century builder add fake windows? If you are paying workers by the hour and stone costs a fortune, you eliminate waste, you simplify, you reduce detail, you cut every corner that won't be noticed. You do not add non-functional decorative windows that serve zero practical purpose, unless the building wasn't constructed the way we think it was. There is a second anomaly that ties directly to this observation. The proportions are wrong. The ceilings in these old buildings are extraordinarily high, 4, 5, 6 meters. Standard humans living and working in the 1800s did not need 6-meter ceilings, not in government offices, not in train stations, not in city halls. Those proportions suggest the buildings were designed for a different purpose, or possibly for people with a very different relationship to architectural space. And when you look at the heating systems in these old buildings, things get even stranger. Many supposedly 19th century buildings had no fireplaces adequate for their volume. The heating systems they supposedly used were completely inadequate for the room sizes. So how were massive 6-meter ceiling halls kept warm in a Russian or Polish winter? The answer may lie in something we will explore in Part 3, the basements. But first, let me show you something from photographic archives almost nobody examines. Look at photographs of St. Petersburg, Russia from the early 1900s. The ground floor windows are almost entirely below street level in many neighborhoods. Not just one building, entire city blocks with buried, sunken ground floors. The official explanation is that the city flooded and sediment accumulated over generations. But here is what they conveniently fail to explain. The sediment layer across these buildings is perfectly uniform in depth. Across hundreds of completely separate buildings, the depth of burial is consistent. That uniformity does not look like gradual flooding over multiple generations of time. That uniformity looks like a single catastrophic event that covered everything simultaneously. And look at what is inside those buried first floors when excavations have opened them. Finished rooms, decorated walls, furniture anchors still embedded in buried floors. People were living and working in those rooms right up until something put them underground, and then those rooms were sealed beneath the streets and forgotten for 200 years. This is not a fringe claim. These excavations are documented in Russian city records. The rooms exist. The question is simply why they were buried and when it happened. Let me tell you about something called a muffle furnace. A muffle furnace is a high-temperature industrial oven used in serious metallurgy. You use them to process metals at extreme temperatures, to fire industrial ceramics. They belong in factories, in workshops, in industrial facilities. They do not belong beneath cathedrals, universities, or government palaces. But here is what researchers have found hidden in basements across Europe and Russia. Large stone chambers with thick walls, deep ash deposits, and heat scoring on the masonry. Chambers that exactly match the structural profile of large muffle furnaces. These are not fireplaces, they are not bread ovens, they are not wine cellars. They are industrial high-temperature processing chambers hidden beneath sacred buildings. And they exist beneath cathedrals, beneath city halls, beneath royal palaces. Why would a religious building need an industrial furnace chamber in its foundations? Why would a royal administration hall have a metallurgical processing space below it? Mainstream historians simply do not address this. It is labeled miscellaneous and ignored. But when researchers map the locations of these sub-basement chambers, a pattern appears. They cluster in geographic areas that align precisely with old Tartarian trade routes. They appear most frequently in buildings that predate 1700 on the official timeline. And here is the part that really cannot be dismissed with a simple explanation. These chambers share structural similarities across continents, from Russia to France to America. The same design, the same construction technique, the same dimensions, thousands of miles apart. If each city independently designed identical basement furnaces, that would be extraordinary. But if a single civilization built them all to the same standard specification, it makes sense. A civilization that understood advanced materials processing on a global industrial scale. A civilization whose name has been systematically removed from the history books. Now let me add another crucial layer to this basement mystery: the hidden levels. In many cities, the official basement level of old buildings is not the original ground floor. When engineers and explorers dig beneath the official basement level, they find more More rooms, more corridors, more chambers extending further downward into the earth. In Paris, Chicago, and Moscow, there are underground levels that are completely unmapped. In dozens of other cities across the world, the same hidden spaces have been found. Urban explorers call these hidden spaces sublevels. Municipal engineers call them anomalies. I call them evidence of something deliberately buried and intentionally forgotten. Because when you cross-reference these spaces with old military survey maps from the 1700s, the picture becomes impossible to explain with the standard academic framework. Some of these underground rooms are clearly marked on 18th century military maps as active spaces. Active, functional spaces. Not storage, not structural foundations, not drainage. Rooms that were in regular use. Rooms that appear on maps made before the official founding date. Maps that show operational buildings at sites that the official record claims were empty wilderness. Buildings on maps, wilderness in the history books. That contradiction demands an explanation. Let me give you one specific, verifiable example from American history. The city of St. Louis, Missouri, was officially founded by French settlers in 1764, but explorers found enormous earthenworks at the site that predated any European settlement. Those mounds, Cahokia, show evidence of a city that once held up to 20,000 residents, a city with planned streets, residential districts, and ceremonial architecture, a city that existed centuries before Europeans supposedly arrived to build civilization there. And this pattern repeats itself across North America, across South America, across Asia. Everywhere you look closely, you find evidence of sophisticated prior occupation that official history either misdates wildly or pretends never happened.
Let's talk about construction timelines, because this is where the story truly collapses. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow was officially built between 1839 and 1883. 44 years for one cathedral. That is actually plausible for the 19th century. Now look at the detail on this building. Marble, mosaics, gold leaf, carved granite. Everything done without power tools, without diesel cranes, without modern scaffolding systems. 44 years starts to look less plausible when you break down the individual tasks. The marble work alone, imported, cut, polished, and installed without electric tools, would require a workforce of thousands of specialized craftsmen working full-time for decades. Now compare that single building to what supposedly happened in Chicago in 1893. Over 215 buildings of equal or greater complexity in under 2 years. The math does not work. It does not add up no matter how you adjust the variables. Modern construction researchers have tried seriously to estimate the necessary workforce. The numbers they reach require more skilled craftsmen than the entire city of Chicago had. By conservative estimates, you would need 40,000 master stonemasons working together. Chicago in 1893 had a total population of approximately 1 million people. Finding 40,000 master craftsmen in that population in that era is essentially impossible. There were not 40,000 master stonemasons anywhere near Chicago in 1893. There were not 40,000 master stonemasons in all of North America combined. So either the official construction timeline is wrong, or these buildings already existed. This is the core of what alternative historians have been arguing for over 2 decades. The argument is not that Tartaria built American cities. That would be oversimplifying. The argument is that many of these grand structures predate the civilization that claims them, that governments moved into existing grand structures after a catastrophic reset event, and then commissioned new histories, new plaques, and new founding stories for the buildings. It sounds like an extraordinary claim until you examine the photographic evidence carefully. When you study the earliest photographs of newly built World's Fair structures, something is wrong. The buildings look aged, not new, not freshly plastered, not recently completed. They have patina, weathering patterns, and structural settling that takes 50 years to develop. In photographs supposedly taken the year of construction, these buildings look a century old. Historians explain this by saying early photography made everything appear washed out and aged, but that explanation collapses completely when you compare photos of other new buildings. Factories, warehouses, and simple homes from the exact same period look brand new in photos. The basic structures photograph as fresh and new. Only the grand, ornate structures look ancient. Only the buildings with the architectural complexity that takes decades to achieve look old. Ask yourself, why would the aging effect apply selectively only to the complex buildings? Unless the complex buildings actually were old in a way that the simple new ones were not. There is one more construction anomaly I want to show you before we move to the maps. Look at the stone used in many of these supposedly 19th century structures. The stone has been cut with a precision that exceeds what hand tools can achieve. Perfectly flat surfaces, perfectly right angles, perfectly consistent measurements across blocks. Modern stone cutters with diamond-tipped electric saws struggle to match this precision. Masons using chisels and hammers simply cannot produce these tolerances consistently. The stone was cut by something that had more control, more consistency, and more power. What that tool or technology was, that is the question that mainstream history refuses to ask. Now I want to talk about something completely verifiable and absolutely beyond dispute: old maps. Specifically European cartographic maps from the 1500s through the 1700s. These maps are preserved in public archives. You can view many of them right now online. The British Library has them. The Library of Congress has them. They are publicly accessible. And on these maps, there is a territory labeled in Latin as Tartaria or Tartary. This is not a fringe claim. It is a fully documented historical fact. Mainstream historians acknowledge that Tartaria appeared on maps. They just minimize it. The 1771 Encyclopedia Britannica article on Tartaria listed Tartaria as the largest empire on Earth, larger than China, larger than the Ottoman Empire, larger than all of Europe put together. And yet, this is the critical point, almost nobody learns about this in school. The Encyclopedia Britannica article on Tartaria runs to several very detailed pages. It describes the empire's regions, its subdivisions, its people, and its ruling structures. It describes Muscovite Tartaria, Chinese Tartaria, independent Tartaria, and more subregions. This is not a fictional country on a fantasy map made by an ignorant cartographer. This territory was treated as real, contemporary functioning political geography in 1771. So what happened? How does the largest empire in human history vanish from collective memory? The official academic answer is that Tartaria was never truly a unified empire. They say European mapmakers used the name loosely to describe various disconnected nomadic groups. That might partially explain the name's geographic breadth, but it does not explain the detailed political structure described in the Britannica article. It does not explain why diplomatic correspondence from the 1600s references Tartarian rulers. It does not explain why trade records, tax ledgers, and military reports mention Tartarian forces. A loose geographic label for nomadic herders does not generate diplomatic correspondence. Diplomatic correspondence requires a government. A government requires a civilization. Something organized and powerful was there, something large enough to fill all those records, and whatever it was removed from the historical narrative with extraordinary thoroughness. When you search academic databases for Tartaria references, the pattern is shocking.
Before 1800, the name appears constantly in encyclopedias, maps, letters, and trade documents. After 1800, it essentially vanishes. Within a few decades, it stops appearing entirely. Things do not disappear from history by natural processes of forgetting over a few decades. They disappear because someone with authority and a motive makes a deliberate decision. That decision is to remove the record and replace it with a different story. Now here is a geographic detail that connects the map evidence directly to the architecture. Plot the locations of the grand unexplained buildings on a world map. Then overlay those locations with the borders of Tartaria as shown on 17th century maps. The concentration of anomalous architecture inside those old borders is not coincidental. The highest density of buried ground floors appears inside those borders.
The highest density of basement furnace chambers appears inside those borders. The highest density of buildings with impossible timelines is also inside those borders. All three anomaly categories cluster in the same geographic space. All three categories of anomalies cluster in the same geographic space on the same old maps. The map and the architecture are telling the same story in two different languages. And the story they are both telling is that something very large and very organized existed there. Here's a simple exercise I want you to try with your own browser right now. Search for St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then search for the Pennsylvania State Capitol in Harrisburg, United States. Then search for the Pantheon in Paris, France. Look at all three images side by side and observe what you see. The proportions are nearly identical across all three buildings. The dome-to-base ratios are almost exactly the same in all three structures. Column spacing, entrance portico width, and the height of the drum beneath the dome. These three buildings are on three different continents. They were supposedly designed by three completely separate architects working independently. They were officially built in three different centuries for three different purposes, and yet architecturally, structurally, and proportionally, they are essentially the same building. Mainstream architectural history explains this as the neoclassical tradition. Everyone was inspired by ancient Rome and Greece, so similar forms naturally emerged. But that explanation works only if you believe every architect made the same specific choices. The same column diameter to height ratio, the same drum elevation above the main cornice, the same number of entrance steps, the same window rhythm on the drum's circumference. The probability of independently identical choices at that detail level is vanishingly small. In engineering terms, that level of coincidence is statistically impossible. In engineering, we call that level of coincidence statistically impossible. The more logical explanation is that these buildings were designed from the same blueprint, not inspired by the same general style, literally constructed from the same standardized system, a design system that was globally distributed before the modern era of international communication. And when you examine the geographic distribution, the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. These nearly identical structures appear in cities founded at very different claimed dates. Washington, D.C. was officially founded in 1790, St. Petersburg was officially founded in 1703, and yet their grandest public buildings share the same architectural DNA at a measurable level. If you were building a new civilization on top of the ruins of a previous one, what would you do? You would claim the existing grand buildings as your own new constructions. You would assign them new architects, new founding dates, new historical plaques, and generation by generation, the real origin would fade until the truth became a conspiracy theory. This is not a radical new idea. It is the natural logic of how conquering civilizations behave. It is what history shows us every single time one power replaces another. Every empire that has ever dominated another has rewritten the dominated culture's history. The Romans claimed Greek temples as inspirations for buildings they actually inherited. The Christians converted pagan sites into churches and called them newly founded holy places. This is what civilizations do. They absorb, rename, and rewrite. The question is not whether this happened, the question is how recently it happened. And the architectural evidence suggests this happened far more recently than we want to believe. More recently than any textbook is willing to admit, within the last 200 years, there is one more architectural feature I need to walk you through before we get to the reset. It is the feature that ties everything else together in a way that is difficult to dismiss, and it has to do with the domes, the spires, and the towers. Look at the skyline of any major old European or American city from above. What you see is a landscape of domes and spires rising above every other structure, not just churches, government buildings, banks, train stations, universities. Every major institutional building of the 19th century was built with a dome or a tall spire. The official explanation is purely aesthetic. Domes signal importance in grandeur, and that is partially true. But it does not explain the structural specifics, because these domes and spires are not just decorative shapes sitting on top of buildings. They are electrically conductive structures mounted at optimal heights above ground level. Many of them are made of copper or contain copper components that have been documented. Copper is one of the best electrical conductors known to human civilization. When you mount a large copper dome at the right height, it behaves like a very large antenna. It can receive electromagnetic energy from the atmosphere, and it can radiate energy outward. Nikola Tesla understood this principle deeply and wrote about it extensively. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower project was designed to do exactly this on an industrial scale. But here is what Tesla himself said in several interviews and letters toward the end of his life. He said he was not inventing a new system, he was rediscovering a system that already existed, that he had found evidence of a prior global energy transmission network, a network that used large, elevated conductive structures to distribute power wirelessly. When you map the locations of the largest domed and spired buildings in the Northern Hemisphere, the distribution pattern is not random and not purely driven by population density. The spacing between major domed capitals follows a remarkably consistent mathematical interval. Researchers have calculated that the major domed capitals are separated by distances that relate to the circumference of the Earth in simple whole number ratios. This is not an accident. Random architectural choices do not produce mathematically consistent spacing. The only way to get that spacing pattern is to plan it deliberately on a global scale. And planning anything deliberately on a global scale requires a global civilization. Now connect this to the basement furnace chambers we discussed in Part 3. If the towers and domes were collecting and distributing atmospheric energy, the basement chambers may have been the processing nodes in that same energy network. The underground chambers with their thick heat-scoring walls may have been energy converters, converting received electromagnetic energy into usable heat and mechanical power. It sounds extraordinary, but it solves several problems that conventional history cannot. It explains why those underground chambers were built under public buildings and not factories. It explains why the chambers appear in geographically spaced clusters and not randomly. It explains why the buildings above those chambers all have elevated conductive structures. And it explains why after whatever catastrophe happened, the technology stopped working. Because if the network was damaged in enough nodes, the whole system would go dark, and a civilization dependent on that network for heat, light, and power would collapse rapidly. This is speculative. I want to be honest about that.
But it is the kind of speculation that matches the physical evidence we actually have, and it raises a question that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. If a civilization that had free wireless energy suddenly lost all of it, what would happen next? What would the survivors do? What would they tell their children about why the lights went out? And what story would a conquering power tell about buildings it moved into but could not replicate? I do not have the final answers to those questions today, but I believe the architecture itself is trying to tell us something. We just need to learn how to read it. Let me give you 5 specific buildings that each destroy the official construction narrative. 5 buildings you can research yourself. 5 buildings with verifiable records. I want to be precise here because specifics matter more than generalities in this kind of research. The first building is the Palais du Trocadéro in Paris, France. The official record says it was built for the 1878 World's Fair in just over 2 years. The building featured elaborate neoclassical facades with thousands of carved stone elements. Each element was individually handcrafted. No 2 pieces are exactly the same. Each carved element, every column capital, every figure, every decorative panel is unique. No two are exactly the same. This is not mass production. This is individual handcraft. A single master stone carver working full-time might complete 30 to 50 such pieces per year. The Trocadero has thousands of them. The math requires decades, not 2 years of construction. The second building is the old Executive Office Building in Washington, D.C. It was supposedly built between 1871 and 1888, 17 years for a single government building. But the building has 553 rooms, over 1,500 windows, and miles of granite corridor. The granite exterior features a French Second Empire style with extraordinary carved detail. Independent stone masonry experts who have examined the exterior estimate it represents more than 200 years of skilled hand carving at the workforce levels available in 1871. The building's own construction records show periods where very little measurable progress occurred. 3- and 4-year spans where the official record shows almost no construction activity at all. Were the workers on strike for 3 years? Was material delivery that inconsistent? Or was the building already largely complete and the construction timeline partially fabricated? The third example is the Milan Cathedral, the Duomo di Milano in northern Italy. Official history says construction began in 1386 and ended in 1965, nearly 600 years. 600 years of continuous construction, supposedly because medieval builders worked slowly. But when you examine which sections were supposedly built in which century, the pattern is wrong. The oldest sections do not show the primitive construction techniques of 14th century masonry. The supposedly newest sections from the 1800s and 1900s show signs of far greater age than claimed. The weathering, the organic growth patterns in the joints, the subsidence patterns, they do not match the claimed dates when you apply standard architectural forensic techniques. The fourth building is the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. itself. The current dome was supposedly completed in 1863 in the middle of the Civil War. In the middle of a devastating national war, Abraham Lincoln insisted on finishing the dome. He called it a symbol of national unity and refused to stop the work. He is famously quoted as saying the completion of the dome was a symbol of national unity, but think about that logistically for a moment. The cast-iron dome weighs approximately 9 million pounds, 4,000 metric tons. It was supposedly cast, transported, and installed during active wartime with limited industry, with soldiers dying in Virginia 60 miles away and the country's economy under severe strain. And the dome, when examined closely, shows weathering patterns inconsistent with 1863. The stone aging does not match a structure that is only 160 years old. The fifth building is the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Officially built by the Vanderbilt family between 1889 and 1995, just 6 years. The Biltmore is the largest privately owned house in the United States. 250 rooms, a 65-foot ceiling in the banquet hall, a library with 10,000 books fitted into custom-built carved wooden shelving, gardens covering over 8,000 acres designed by Frederick Lahm Olmsted. In 6 years, with 1889 technology, with no electricity for the first several years of construction. Construction experts who have examined the Biltmore closely estimate the actual labor represented corresponds to somewhere between 20 to 30 years of construction at period labor rates. Not 6, not with the workforce records that survive. Each of these 5 buildings has a story that does not survive serious mathematical scrutiny. And there are not 5 buildings like this in the world, there are thousands. Once you learn to see the pattern, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere you look. I want to step back for a moment and talk about what this evidence actually means, because the implications go far more than just correcting some dates on old buildings. If many of the grand structures we call 19th century architecture actually predate the 19th century, then the civilization that built them had capabilities we are not currently giving it credit for. A civilization that could cut stone to tolerances matching modern diamond saw precision. A civilization that could design uniform buildings and construct them on multiple continents.
simultaneously to the same specifications across thousands of miles of distance. A civilization that understood electromagnetic energy distribution at an engineering level. A civilization organized enough to maintain global architectural standards across vast distances. That is not a primitive empire of scattered nomads. That is an advanced global civilization. And the evidence suggests that this civilization ended abruptly, not gradually. Gradual collapses leave traces: declining quality, simpler buildings, smaller populations. The archaeological and architectural record shows something different from gradual decline. It shows a sharp before and after, sophisticated and then suddenly absent, advanced construction and then suddenly rough-hewn, irregular, improvised architecture. That kind of sharp transition in the record is the signature of catastrophic discontinuity, and the discontinuity appears to have happened within the lifetime of people born in the late 1700s. People who were alive on both sides of whatever events separated the old world from the new one. Their children would have known the old world was different, their grandchildren perhaps less so. Their great-grandchildren would have been born into the new narrative and accepted it completely. By the fifth generation, the old world would be myth. By the sixth, it would be conspiracy theory. We are somewhere around the fifth or sixth generation now, which is precisely why this research feels so strange and uncomfortable to engage with. We are trying to remember something that was specifically designed to be forgotten, and the only witnesses that survive the forgetting are the buildings themselves.
So if these buildings predate their official histories, what catastrophe created the gap? What event could erase a global civilization so completely that its own buildings are forgotten? There are several serious theories, and I want to present them fairly. The first theory centers on massive flooding events across the early to mid-1800s. Geological records show evidence of unusual large-scale flooding across the northern hemisphere. The year without a summer in 1816 caused agricultural collapse across Europe and North America. Some researchers believe this was not merely a volcanic winter, but part of a larger catastrophe, a catastrophe whose sediment layers are exactly what we find under St. Petersburg's first floors. The second theory involves sudden depopulation, a pandemic, a war, or an unknown event. Historical records from the early 1800s describe mass population movements and empty territories. Lewis and Clark encountered numerous abandoned settlements during their 1804 expedition westward, settlements showing signs of sophisticated recent habitation but completely devoid of people. The third theory involves deliberate military conquest followed by systematic record erasure. Under this model, certain emerging powers destroyed Tartaria's physical and written records. Then they claimed the existing infrastructure as their own newly built civilization. Each of these theories has real evidentiary support and real weaknesses simultaneously. None of them is fully proven, but each points toward the same general conclusion. Something major happened in the first decades of the 1800s that broke the historical continuity. The architectural record, the cartographic record, and the geological record all show this rupture. The official narrative papers over this rupture with deliberately vague language and with documentation that is suspiciously absent for the most critical transitional decades. The question is no longer whether something happened. The evidence is clear on that point. The question is what it was, who survived it, and what they chose to remember afterward. I started this video by asking you to look at a building and tell me who built it. After everything we covered today, the zero windows, the buried floors, the basement furnaces, the impossible timelines, the vanishing empire from 1,000 maps, the identical blueprints, I hope you understand why that question has no simple answer anymore. I am not telling you what to believe. I am showing you what the evidence actually looks like. I am asking you to look at the primary sources yourself, the maps, the photos, the records. Ask the questions that textbooks skip over and historians change the subject to avoid, because the truth about who actually built our world is hiding in plain sight. It is hiding inside the walls, beneath the floors, and on the maps they forgot to burn. If this made you look at history differently, share this video with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe, because in the next video we are going underground, literally. We are going into the sealed sub-basements, and what is down there will floor you completely.